Stories are not just entertainment, but they can be shelter. They can make you feel emotions you otherwise might not get to experience in your life, like love. Through stories, we can live a second life, stepping into worlds and experiences that exist only on the page or screen. The cool part is that experience doesn't end when the story itself does. Fan art, edits, and other creative responses allow us to engage with stories more deeply and from new perspectives. By seeing how someone else interprets a scene, we gain new insights and a fuller understanding of the work, because the way a story is perceived also becomes part of its meaning. Some stories stay with us for years. I remember watching the first season of Stranger Things and then realizing how much my life had changed by the time season 3 came out. And when the final season dropped, I was in a completely different place again. A long-running, well-loved TV show like this leaves a lasting impression, even if you're not deeply invested in its lore or fandom. Ever since the release of Stranger Things Season 5, Byler, the fan-favorite ship between Mike and Will, has been everywhere on my For You page, and I was honestly not that invested in this ship until I saw some of the edits that came out from this. They've all been emotionally devastating, with some of them even being 20 minutes long, but my favorites are usually the ones with some sort of song that makes you reinterpret the moment in a whole new way. Speaking of, every single edit from any fandom with Hamilton is just perfection. But with any piece of media, and especially one as popular as Stranger Things, it's almost impossible to engage with these edits without also being pulled into the broader discourse around the ship itself. And in this video essay, I'm going to be spoiling some things, so now is a good time to click off if you want to. To understand queer media and why certain ships resonate so deeply with people, it helps to look at the historical context. If you're younger than me, you might not remember a time when queer representation on TV was rare, but I do. At one point, if you searched for lesbian characters on television, the L word was practically the only thing that came up. Many people felt it was acceptable for gay people to exist, but they didn't want to see it depicted in any way. While this reflects the past, similar attitudes still persist today, sometimes with even more vitriol as queer visibility increases. You see, in the 1930s, Hollywood established something called the Hays Code, which is a strict moral guideline, and it lasted until 1968. Its stated goal was to protect audiences from quote-unquote immoral content, which included things like profanity, sexual material, glorified crime, and criticism of religion. It was this way to uphold correct standards of life. In practice, it shaped how stories were told, regulating not just what could appear on screen, but how audiences were meant to interpret characters and behavior as a whole. Criminals and morally impure characters had to be punished, and sympathy was tightly controlled. Moral complexity, nuanced perspectives, and empathy for those outside social norms, therefore, were severely limited. Under this system, queer characters were almost always portrayed as villainous or tragic. Homosexuality was labeled as sexual perversion, preventing queer lives from being shown openly or positively. Interracial relationships, challenges of authority, and other forms of difference faced similar constraints. When a culture consistently signals which lives are virtuous and which desires are dangerous, then audiences come to accept these judgments as natural rather than as the result of deliberate cultural shaping. Intentional or not, this normalized a worldview in which certain lives, desires, and perspectives were seen as deviant, and repeated exposure made these ideals feel like common sense. Traces of this framework are still visible in today's media and storytelling. This pattern I find particularly visible in the horror genre, where societal norms are enforced through the story. The genre frequently acts as a moral allegory, punishing transgression and marking anyone other as dangerous. Characters who challenge social norms about things like sexuality, gender, race, or class often face disproportionate consequences. For example, Black characters were historically underrepresented and often killed early in narratives, while something like the final girl trope rewards the virtuous, cautious, and socially conforming female survivor. Sexual activity or rule breaking often leads to punishment in slasher films, reinforcing the message that deviation from social norms carries risk. Queer-coded characters frequently appear as villains or monsters, embodying cultural anxieties about difference. Even when not villainized, their stories often end in tragedy, sending the message message that deviation from social norms brings suffering. Ironically, because of this, horror sometimes offered queer audiences a rare chance at visibility, even if it was in a negative light. When queer characters appeared at all, they were coded rather than named, in ways such as flamboyant mannerisms, moral decadence, obsession, or framing them as predatory. One of my favorite literary examples is actually Carmilla, which is a gothic novella often read as a queer vampire story. It centers on a close relationship between two young women, with one portrayed as mysterious and potentially dangerous. She preys on the protagonist, symbolically warning against same-sex desire. While not a film originally, Carmilla operates similarly to the Hays Code era storytelling, signaling that queer desire is risky or morally suspect, without saying it outright. Learning to recognize these subtle signs or read too much into a piece of media becomes essential cues for viewers seeking representation. This wasn't just a product of the Hays Code either. It reflected a broader reality in which queer people had to hide their identities to avoid persecution. Learning to read these cues became a survival skill, and over time it gave rise to coded characters, or figures signaling queerness to those who knew how to look, while avoiding censorship or backlash. The lasting impact of this era is clear. By repeatedly linking queerness to crime, immorality, or danger, the Hays Code embedded prejudice into storytelling itself. Audiences learned to unconsciously associate queer characters with warning signs or inevitable punishment. Sympathy was rarely extended to anyone outside the narrow definition of acceptable. In contrast, queer audiences became adept at reading subtext, searching for glances and gestures that might reflect their own experiences, even when villainized. This skill, born of necessity, allows creators to provide representation even under extreme constraints, but it also reinforced a pattern in which queer lives were only visible through caution, tragedy, or villainy. This is precisely the environment that has led to ships like Byler.
Byler, 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 Byler.
Ships have been around since media was a thing, and probably since storytelling was a thing. It might not have been called that, but I feel like it's just inevitable that you get attached to a character that you like at some point. We naturally form attachments and project emotions, desires, and imagine futures onto characters that we care about. Shipping allows fans to explore relationships in ways the story itself might not, filling in gaps, imagining alternate realities, or simply seeing people we identify with experience a connection. For queer audiences, this is especially meaningful. It's often one of the only ways to envision relationships that affirm identity, desire, and love, even when mainstream media sidelines or erases them. Beyond all that, it's just kind of fun sometimes to ship two people. While queer representation is more visible today than it once was, that visibility has frequently been met with backlash. Queer characters or ships are still dismissed as unrealistic, perverse, political, or niche, revealing how easily stories centered outside the assumed default identity are treated as exceptions rather than a natural part of storytelling, or even just parts of being human. One of the most common arguments against ships, not just in Stranger Things by the way, but across all media, is that they are unrealistic. Putting aside the fact that our characters were in another dimension fighting a giant spider with a Vecnussi for a face, that's totally realistic, bro. Don't worry about it, it was totally realistic. Realism is rarely a standard that we apply consistently. Stories rely on something called suspension of disbelief. We accept monsters, alternate dimensions, psychic powers, and resurrected villains to access emotional truths. Audiences crave fear, longing, grief, and hope, not strict realism. So why is queer love treated differently? Why is the desire for connection punished or questioned when all other extraordinary experiences and stories are granted legitimacy? In addition to that, taking it a step further and mocking queer fans, or just any ship in a fandom, for hoping their characters might have a happy ending feels kind of cruel. It sends the message that you're not allowed to even imagine a better future for them, so why imagine one for yourself? The claim that queer ships are not only unrealistic but perverse is also largely a leftover from the long history of equating homosexuality with sexual deviance. What most people are hoping for in these ships is not physical closeness, but connection. The desire to be understood, chosen, and loved in a deeply intimate way that romance allows. Romance has always been more than just physical, at least for straight couples. That's precisely why Byler mattered. Its appeal lies in the idea of two friends growing into love, not being rooted or begun in anything explicit or transgressive. Within queer media history, that kind of innocent, emotional relationship has been especially rare to see. Importantly, such a relationship would not have defined the characters' entire identities or arcs. It would have been part of who they were, not the sum of what they became. A story like this would have functioned as a coming-of-age narrative that treats queerness as ordinary and human rather than something suspect or corrupting. Instead, the canon chooses to frame Will's arc as one of finding himself, which is not unimportant. However, it is worth questioning whether that full process is actually even fulfilled. Will only comes out to his friends and family under the threat that his abuser would reveal it for him, not because he felt safe or ready to do so himself. His disclosure is driven by fear of exposure, rejection, and the loss of his relationships, not by self-acceptance. That moment may be honest to a lot of people's real experiences, but it's not a joyful or affirming one, and it stops short of portraying queerness or even queer acceptance as something that can even exist without punishment or coercion. The truth of his character as well is that Will is kind of forced into self-acceptance because he has been alone his entire life, knows nothing else but being on his own, and isn't even given the opportunity to explore being in a relationship during this entire story arc. By the way, I'm not even sure that Vecna needed to read Will's mind. I mean, he saw the same scene we did. In fact, Mike was probably at a greater risk here of being outed, to be honest. The truth is, self-acceptance is often actually only the beginning of a queer person's journey, even though it's often presented as the entire story. Acceptance of oneself does not automatically lead to fulfillment, safety, happiness, or closure. In fact, many queer people reach self-acceptance earlier than popular narratives allow, and they are still left alone in the aftermath. Will was fortunate enough not to be alone, yet narratives that end there risk misrepresenting self-acceptance as resolution rather than just the beginning. Many viewers, including myself, feel that a character like Will, who has endured 5 seasons of fear, isolation, and loss, deserves at least the chance to experience joy and to have something finally go his way. Instead, the story treats him as fortunate simply because his family accepts him, denying him a fuller emotional payoff he has earned, and so many straight characters receive. In this way, I also think Will risks falling into the queer tragedy category that's been known all too well. Nothing really goes right for him. By the end of his story, he is clearly not in a better place than he was at the very beginning. His childhood was stolen from him, he faces rejection from the person he cares about, and even the future that Mike imagines for him is not set in stone. We don't even know if this person he's with is his epilogue boyfriend or just a random man that he's meeting at the bar. His arc ends up feeling lukewarm. It's not entirely bleak, but it also doesn't provide enough payoff to feel satisfying for a lot of people, leaving the audience with a sense of unresolved longing for something more. This longing for some closure then manifests for many as Byler. I'm not thorough enough to catalog all the evidence. Other thoughtful fans have already done an incredible job of tracking the signs across seasons that this pairing could have been canon, but from what I've seen, it was absolutely possible. Done well, it could have added layers of complexity to both Mike and Will, making them more interesting characters and serving as a beacon of hope for countless queer kids. Even so, closure and emotional payoff at the end doesn't necessarily require Byler to be canon. Even if their relationship remained platonic, the bond between these two characters built over years of friendship is undeniable. Yet the show never acknowledges this buildup and offers no meaningful resolution. Instead, it shrugs off the tension. Mike isn't upset about Will's crush, so everything is supposedly fine. But that's exactly the problem. What about the longing, the care, the moments that made their connection meaningful? None of it is addressed. Feelings like these, crushes, love, whatever you want to call them, they change friendships, queer or straight, and they deserve the same thoughtful exploration a heterosexual relationship would have received. This isn't about forcing Mike into a specific sexuality or dictating his feelings towards Will. It's about the fact that a rich, nuanced dynamic was completely ignored, seemingly because of its queer nature. So why introduce this plot point only to undermine it? The connection between these characters was established the moment we learned that Will had a crush on Mike, but it ended in a rushed and messy way and then dismissed without a second thought. In doing so, the show missed an opportunity to explore something real and a relationship dynamic that also, by the way, is not exclusively queer. It could have been understood as a universal story of unrequited love, which I think is what they were going for, but if that was the case, I still think it was unfinished. But one of the recurring topics that I've been seeing discussed about Byler is actually predominantly about Mike, and the missed opportunity to explore things like internalized homophobia, and the slow, often confusing realization that what you've labeled as platonic feelings might actually be something more. especially for someone raised in an environment that never allowed space to question or accept those possibilities. Mike's sexuality is left ambiguous by the show, and intentionally so. He never states whether he's attracted to boys or not. This ambiguity is a major reason some viewers argue that the show engaged in queerbaiting. There is no clear rejection of Will's romantic feelings until I guess you could argue halfway through the final episode, but that was like 2 throwaway lines, and again, nothing was really discussed during this scene. Instead, the general audience is encouraged to assume Mike is straight because he is dating a girl and does not express queerness in an overt or stereotypical way. That assumption relies on a harmful stereotype that sexuality must be performed to be understood. It reinforces the idea that straightness and queerness are defined by your behavior, mannerisms, or presentation, and you must mark yourself with these traits, perform them for other people, which ultimately harms both queer and straight men by equating identity with performative norms rather than an internal experience. Many queer people do not pass as queer, but that doesn't make their identities null. It instead only acts to pressure queer people to perform their identity in legible ways to be believed, and it restricts straight men by narrowing the range of acceptable emotional expression. Because of these expectations, a lot of general viewers don't even recognize the romantic moments between 2 characters. They are conditioned to look for stereotypical gay moments rather than the subtle, intimate gestures that reflect 2 people who care deeply for each other. Mike's character could have offered a profound exploration of internalized homophobia and self-acceptance, by the way, potentially even more complex than Will's, because his journey would likely have been slower and much more difficult. Any acknowledgement of queer feelings would have carried real risk for him. While it may seem easy to joke about things like this now, in a time when queerness is more openly discussed, many people of that era were never taught that their feelings could be safe. A lot of people live their whole lives unready to confront what those feelings might mean and the real physical risks you were putting yourself in to admit them to any other person. How many obituaries are the coming out letters of people who spent their entire lives in secret, either because they were too scared to come out or their lives were ended prematurely by hatred? Even if Mike had some awareness of his own feelings, his life would have been shaped by the constant pressure to conform, to perform a narrow, socially enforced version of masculinity under the threat of punishment. That context makes the potential of his relationship with Will even more compelling. Who better to navigate such feelings with than a best friend? As I mentioned before, queer identities in media are often framed through suffering, characters being bullied, rejected, punished, sidelined, and their experiences are validated only through that trauma. But in this case, they could have reinforced each other's identities and provided a space of mutual safety. A healthy, reciprocal relationship would have disrupted the notion that queerness must be punished, showing instead a slow realization that one could be safe, loved, and happy. It would have reframed queerness not as a source of inevitable pain, but as something compatible with stability, affection, and belonging. Allowing Will and Mike a loving, innocent, and reciprocal relationship would have been a meaningful departure from the painful patterns of queer love portrayed in the media in the past. It is also worth pushing back on the people who insist that some were naive or foolish to hope for something more out of this story, whether it's specifically Byler or just hoping for a better representation for Will's character. Stranger Things positioned itself from the beginning as a story about outcasts, kids who didn't fit in, who lived on the margins, and who survived by finding one another. Its early seasons centered around characters who were isolated, vulnerable, and socially excluded, and that focus is a large part of why the show resonated so deeply with audiences. As the series grew more popular, however, it became increasingly shaped by the expectations of a broad general audience rather than the specific perspective that defined its beginnings. In doing so, it began to default to what has long been treated as the standard viewer in science fiction, gaming, and D&D adjacent spaces. And that is straight men. The show leans heavily on familiar 1980s underdog narratives where success for an outcast often meant a socially awkward straight boy overcoming the jock who bullied or emasculated him, usually rewarded with popularity or a romantic interest. The cultural landscapes have shifted since the 1980s, though. Fandom culture has moved into the mainstream, but in the process, many of the people who once found safety in those spaces have been pushed back into the margins. This is a trend I've seen a lot of people talk about in self-proclaimed nerd spaces in the 2020s. Communities once built around shared vulnerability now often center those who were already closest to cultural acceptance in the first place. In that context, a story about outcasts falls short when it fails to provide its truly marginalized characters the same emotional safety and fulfillment it grants others. Enjoying D&D or excelling academically carries far less social risk than it once did. Being openly queer, however, still invites real hostility and danger. Continuing to rely on outdated underdog narratives centered around a default archetype ignores where marginalization exists today. Let's say, though, that the goal was not to adapt the story for contemporary audiences with a 1980s aesthetic, but remain grounded in the social realities of the 1980s. Why then are many of the defining struggles of the time only lightly addressed, if at all? Problems like racism, the AIDS crisis, and the disability stigma are reduced to schoolyard taunts instead of giving them any depth. Many straight men, accustomed to media built with them as the default heroes, can find it uncomfortable to confront a character who reflects parts of themselves while also being queer, something that they might see as unfamiliar or unrelatable. Ironically, outcasts have often had to learn to deal with this kind of perspective from a young age. Women, for example, have been playing as male characters in video games for decades, learning to inhabit perspectives outside of their own, to identify with male bodies, male perspectives, and male narratives, not occasionally, but constantly. This was treated as neutral, even natural, because maleness itself was framed as unmarked and universal. Queer people historically haven't had the same freedom to imagine themselves in stories, especially stories that depict love, longing, and joy. It's no wonder that those who haven't had to do this often struggle to recognize or accept narratives that center true outsiders. Given that Stranger Things is explicitly framed as a story about bullied and marginalized kids, it's unsurprising that longtime viewers hoped Will might finally have a storyline where things actually worked out for him. Within this classic general underdog framework, even women are constrained. The nerd woman is rarely allowed to be too threatening, too smart, too powerful, or too independent without eventually being softened through something like romance. By the way, this isn't a criticism of Lumax or Elle specifically. I actually really loved their characters, but we do have to acknowledge the broader pattern in which women are rarely permitted to exist as equals without being framed as non-threatening or conquerable by their male counterparts. This reliance on familiar tropes doesn't just limit female characters, but it also can flatten the straight male protagonist's arc, substituting genuine character development with a story that has honestly already been told and affirmed across decades of film and television. While these stories once resonated as a way of processing real experiences of exclusion, their repetition now feels stale, especially in season 5 when there's so many characters and so little character development throughout the entire season. By this one, both Eleven and Mike are flattened into opposing romantic poles, rather than being allowed to grow as individuals in their own right. Season 3 had actually shown a glimpse of Eleven developing independence and agency, proving that she could exist beyond the role she played in the boys' story. That potential for growth could, and arguably should, have continued in the final season, especially since Eleven and Mike do not even end up together anyway. Instead, the story sidelines her personal development, leaving her arc dependent on romance and self-sacrifice, literally giving up her entire self, rather than fully exploring her agency, resilience, and the possibility of a future defined by her own choices. This makes her journey feel incomplete and also diminishes the impact of the struggles that she endured throughout the entire series. I strongly disagree that Elle's role should have simply been an abused child who represents childhood magic for the boys who did get to have a relatively normal childhood. She deserves to eventually feel safety, autonomy, and joy, and not just through romance. The fact that the characters who endured the most trauma are also the ones hardest hit by the ending, while literally the entirety of Indiana stayed safe from death, apparently, somehow. It just didn't sit well for a lot of people. By the end of the series, she is one of the few characters, alongside Callie, whose story ends badly, suggesting, even if it was unintentional writing, that children who have endured trauma should not fully get to grow up or find personal fulfillment. Framing self-sacrifice and withdrawal as the endpoint of her arc risks sending a subtle message, particularly to young viewers, that surviving hardship may require giving up parts of yourself, your future, and the people you love most, or simply not surviving it at all. Why was hope given to all the other characters, including ones who finished beautiful character development arcs early on in the series, and probably could have died, honestly, while these characters were left with so little? I'm getting a little sidetracked here, as some of this touches on unfinished plot points and other aspects of the finale, but it still fits with the broader framework of why so many viewers were invested in seeing something like Byler play out. 11 deserved independence. It would have allowed her to grow and truly discover herself as a person, rather than existing primarily in relation to Mike. She kissed Mike before she even knew her own name, and took her life before she had a chance to live it on her own terms. She was literally begging this man to love her. Begging. And he couldn't even say it back in their goodbyes. Instead of growing together, their story reads like two trauma-bonded characters too scared to confront their futures or be on their own. Giving them the chance to grow individually would have offered some emotional payoff for all characters and made for a far more compelling story than the stagnation we were left with. And one of the things I think many people don't realize when telling stories specifically about outcasts is that increased visibility in media is not always purely positive. It can also bring a lot of backlash, especially when a story is mishandled. And I'm not just talking about 11. Will's character in the final episodes drew widespread criticism online, not because he was gay, but because his arc felt poorly executed. Unfortunately, this gave homophobic voices an opening to claim that the negative reactions to this episode were solely about his sexuality. In reality, many criticisms I saw were about the actual storytelling choices rather than Will being queer. For example, why would Vecna, in the middle of a physical battle, bring up Will's sexuality to his family? While it was meant as a threat in the context of the rest of the action-heavy season, this line felt out of place and confusing. Some viewers question it, and when those critiques mixed with homophobic opinions, it risked giving the impression that the story was rejected simply because it included a queer character in it. That said, a major show receiving such a negative response to a coming-out scene could make the broader industry hesitant to explore queer characters further, fearing similar backlash, without recognizing that much of the criticism was about how the story was handled and not the character's identity. The timing of other shows featuring gay characters that were well-received and celebrated helps highlight this difference. Audiences as a whole weren't rejecting queerness itself. Maybe instead of Elle and Will's destinies getting swapped, it was actually Byler in heated rivalry. This is a major reason why it stings so badly for queer viewers. Some argue that any kind of representation is enough, but it's crucial to engage critically with popular media. Wanting more from a story doesn't mean being ungrateful for the representation that exists. It's about pushing forward, preventing regression, and ensuring that stories continue to offer more than just acceptance, but respect. Allowing Will to have a loving relationship, whether with Mike or another character, would have given one of the largest mainstream shows a chance to place queer characters at the center without making the story explicitly about queerness. For some viewers, seeing subtle glances, yearning, and the coding finally pay off is deeply meaningful. Rather than being told explicitly before a show even begins, he's queer because it's a queer show. Instead, you'd be able to feel it build and come to life on screen. Too often, queer representation is confined to narratives of suffering or is fetishized and sexualized, and while heated rivalry was popular and good, it would have been far more affirming to depict an innocent, non-sexual queer relationship to a broad audience like Stranger Things. By giving Will the possibility of genuine, innocent love, the show could have demonstrated that happiness, safety, and care exists within queer relationships. It's not the lack of canon, but the wasted potential. Stories have the power to imagine futures that real life has often denied for people. Allowing queer characters not just to survive or be accepted, but to love and be loved in return, it's not excessive or unrealistic. It's actually a necessary expansion of what these stories allow themselves to hope for. The point of much of what I'm saying is to explain why so many viewers feel such a deep connection to this specific ship. Had it become canon, this ship would have been a landmark moment in queer history, unironically. One of Netflix's biggest shows, featuring a closeted, complex bisexual or gay man and his best friend saving the world together. It would have offered hope to generations of LGBTQ+ people. And in many ways, it still does. Queer people will continue to keep ships like this alive, like we keep each other alive. I think it's fair to say that the ending was what it was, and honestly, I did cry a few times during the season, so it wasn't emotionally void. But like many fans, I mourn what could have been, like Mike is probably doing right now. Good luck, babe. Before I sign off this video, I wanted to address something else. I think it's wrong to classify every negative comment or criticism about queer media as homophobic, but some truly disgusting remarks get shared alongside reasonable critiques. For anyone who lives in the margins, or as someone whose body, mind, or love has been treated like a problem to solve, remember when you see comments that are truly hateful in nature under something you love. Their hatred isn't the point. Passing it to you is. The goal is not to debate you, it's to contaminate. To touch the thing that you love so that it hurts the next time you reach for it. They want queerness, joy, and recognition to come with a sting, to make you hesitate, to make you smaller, to make you feel alone, even while surrounded by something that once made you feel seen. Do not let a stranger claim space in the part of you that learned how to survive by loving something deeply. A faceless username will never know what it cost you to be here. This kind of rhetoric only works if it succeeds in linking art and your identity with guilt or fear. Keep what loves you back. Keep what found you, and love each other deeply.